Hi, everybody. Just for those who are joining for the first time, my name is Jen Barnhill. I'm a columnist with military.com and the host of Military Dinner Table Conversations. The purpose of these conversations is to better understand the decision making that military families are having, the conversations they're having around the dinner table that impact recruitment and retention. I use these conversations to help inform the articles that I write for military.com. And of course, we share the findings with those stakeholders that are involved in this conversation. Um, just as far as ground rules go, this is a reverse town hall. The format is fluid. We want to hear from everybody and respect everyone's voices and their opinions, whether they agree or disagree. It's a respectful conversation. You can raise your hand to indicate that you would like to speak or come off of mute and I'll call on you to share. And feel free to use the chat if that's helpful. But as this is recorded, just please keep that in mind. And yeah, we'll have a great conversation. Without any further ado, I want to introduce our guest host today, Eileen Huck from the National Military Family Association. She is here to kind of provide expertise on this topic, although I do see many people here who have additional expertise on the topic. So those individuals feel free to share and add to the conversation. But Eileen, I'd love to let you do a little bit of an introduction about where you sit in this space, and then we'll get started.
Sure, Jen, thank you so much. Thank you for organizing this. I think it's a really important topic, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Um, and it's also a pleasure to see so many familiar faces and familiar names. I think we are a group of people who are very interested in and knowledgeable about education. So I'm confident we're going to have a really interesting conversation. For those who don't know me, my name is Eileen Huck, and I'm the acting director of government relations at the National Military Family Association. We are a national nonprofit organization that advocates on behalf of service members and their families, kind of across the scope of quality of life issues. So among the issues that we are really concerned about, of course, is military children's education. I've worked closely with a number of people on the call today on issues related to education. And of course, we are closely following the various proposals that are coming from the administration and from Congress related to school choice options for service for military families. So that's kind of where we're coming from, and I'm interested to hear everyone else's thoughts. And again, think this is going to be a really robust conversation.
Thank you, Eileen. I appreciate that. I just launched first question because I know every single conversation is a little different. The questions I ask are aimed at military families, but if you were a military family member, if you have a stake in this conversation, and you also represent part of the population, you're welcome to participate in both capacities. I know many people who are here both are military family members and also advocates. So feel free to answer those questions. It's not used in a scientific way, but a way that we can kind of keep the conversation going. So my first question was finding out, where everyone is currently sending their children to school. That might help us understand, where everyone sits and what everyone thinks about this conversation. As I know, so far, we have a few who've answered, but I'll give it a second to finish. But one thing I like to do in these conversations is to kind of ask an open-ended question of what brought you to this conversation, and feel free to expand whether you're for or against. Again, just to reiterate, we're going to hear all sides. That's the point, is to kind of come together and understand. So if anyone is willing, as a reporter, I'm willing to deal with uncomfortable silences. So I will wait until someone feels comfortable enough to raise their hand or come off mute and share.
Okay, Jen, I'll go first. Because I don't love awkward silences, and so I'm glad to fill the void there. Hi, everyone. My name is Hiba Abdal. We actually don't have children yet, and so I'm not a user of the education system or some of the family programs in the same way that my teammates are, or fellow friends are and advocates are. But it's important I feel, to understand just some of the impacts, challenges, concerns, questions that our community has about anything that's going on. And it just helps inform, my work. It makes me a better advocate across the board when I can understand contextually how all of these different moving parts and pieces are really impacting military connected families. So that's why I'm joining the conversation, because it gives me a good lens into an experience and a circumstance that I don't currently have. So that's why I'm here. Thanks for having us, as always.
Yeah, thanks, Kiba. Kayla, I think you raised your hand first. Feel free. Oops. You did not intend to raise your hand, or did you want to?
I did.
Okay.
I did. I just am not usually muted. So I'm actually in the early childhood education space. And so this conversation is interesting to me because as I'm seeing the conversations and the proposed legislation and EOs come out regarding school choice, they are frequently referring to the Child Care Development Block Grant and other types of currently existing funding to support those programs. And this is funding that already is not enough for early childhood education. So if it then needs to be spread even thinner, I have concerns. But I want to hear from others who have more expertise in this area.
Thank you, Kayla. Alexandra, I believe you're next.
Hi, thank you so much for having this session. I am a former public school and private school teacher of K through 12, mostly high school. And I have two military kiddos, and they have attended public, private, and charter schools. And I just want to share a very unique experience that does impact a military, decent military community in the New Orleans area. All the New Orleans public schools are charter schools. There is not a traditional public school system. And so I think that having had that experience as a military family, there are significant challenges for military families with charter school systems and charter schools as they kind of have they have their own charter, right? They can write certain things into it. And I saw some gaps and some concerns when trying to essentially have like a child evaluated for an IEP or 504 plan. And so I think that experience, coupled with the amazing experience I have now in the public school system, being in Arlington, Virginia, really cautions me to, as a recommendation overall, like school choice sounds great, but I worry for the families that there's these gaps that they already have with getting special education services or services that they have that they might need for their children. And it took a lot longer than it probably should have than in that all charter school system. And also there are some positive aspects to these programs as well, but it was also very difficult. Like if you're unhappy with your charter school, if you're in an area where there's lots of charter schools or mostly charter schools, you can't just switch. Like it's not that easy. The most desirable ones are usually full. They don't have to accept everybody. It's not like the public schools where you have a neighborhood school that you can go to, and then you can apply to a magnet school. You can apply to a specialty school. It's not like that. So unfortunately, I know a lot about charter schools now, having worked with the Louisiana system. And I will share something that's also really important, I think, for this discussion, that regards to school choice, especially if you're looking at like specialized programs, charter schools, is understanding that some of the states have actually passed advanced registration legislation, including Louisiana, including Virginia, where we've resided. And that allows you to actually apply ahead of time if you have orders for specialty programs for charter schools. But a lot of military families, myself included, don't know those things are already passed in legislation, or don't know how to advocate in the right way for their kids to get priority to be able to put in an application for a choice school in a public school district. And so I think that's a gap that I found personally that I was trying to do some advocacy around. But the MIC3 kind of is this like overarching solution to a lot of things, but it doesn't necessarily address that problem of moving your kid into a like program if the school district doesn't understand that there's legislation supporting that. So sorry, that's my TED Talk for today. If anybody has any follow-up questions, feel free to, reach out to me, and I'm happy to talk with you more, Jennifer, but just appreciate this space to kind of share a little bit of the pluses and minuses to the systems that we have right now for military kids.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And you've touched upon a few things that I've heard from various individuals. There's good, there's bad, there's open questions. I definitely will pick on you throughout this call just to get that insight that you have that you bring to the table. But I definitely want to get to everyone first before we get there. So Nicole, feel free to unmute.
Hi, good afternoon. Nicole Russell. I am an active duty Marine Corps spouse, PCSing this summer from North Carolina to New York, and will be doing the enrollment into public school for the first time with my 4-year-old. Send all the prayers. And I am also the CEO and executive director of the National Association of Federally Impacted Schools, where we advocate for Impact Aid, a federal education funding program that benefits over 1,000 public schools nationwide that serve nearly 8 million students, many of them military-connected students. We we do publicly oppose school choice voucher programs, particularly those that take public funds away from public schools. So that is something that our organization advocates against, particularly using Impact Aid in any way towards a voucher program. And because a lot of these school choice at the federal level, a lot of these school choice bills, legislation aims to take funds away from the public schools that are already underfunded. So I'm glad to hear some good conversations about charter schools, but also just wanted to put a plug in that the overwhelming majority of military connected students do attend public school systems. And I've served on the MIC3, the Military Interstate Children's Compact Commission, as an ex officio board member in the past as well. So I can speak a little to the compact there. Certainly not perfect, does not include everything, but I think there are certainly still some challenges that we can recognize in the military community. Thanks so much for letting me be here.
Thanks, Nicole. And I'm sure, I hope that we can get to kind of those things you've seen and in the reasons that you kind of maybe stand against the vouchers, to hear that side. I'd love to hear any positives, like why that has worked for any family members, but definitely want to hear both sides. Before that, Julie, I saw you raise your hand.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Eileen, for both being here and having this positive conversation where we can have this in a safe space. So I appreciate that. So I wanted to share, and Eileen, you've heard me talk about this story before, so you'll get to hear it again. When we moved to San Diego in 2017, I have a profoundly gifted child. And my child was having a hard time accessing the gifted curriculum, and I wasn't able to properly use the MIC3. I didn't really know what I was doing. It was at the beginning of my education advocacy journey, and we did end up having to place our youngest into private school. That said, I didn't expect anybody else to pay for that. That was on me, right? So that's sort of where I feel about it. I don't believe in using public funds for private education, even though my child's needs weren't being met. That was on me as a parent. So I just wanted to add that perspective, since that's what we're talking about here. And those are the two, we know the two most impacted populations are students that are gifted and students with disabilities. And then of course that cross section when they're considered twice exceptional. So it's a complicated conversation, but I think there's other vehicles that we can use to advocate to help those populations get the services that they need inside our public institutions. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you, Julie.
Thanks.
Does anyone else have any initial thoughts that they want to share? This kind of helps us all kind of get where, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see. Okay. You popped right up. Tanya, sorry. Go for it.
Hi, guys. I'm Tanya. I am an active duty Navy spouse. I have my kids have done pretty much every kind of schooling out there. We've done private, we've done choice programs, we've done public. Right now, I have kids in middle, high school, and college. So we kind of hit the range of it. I think one part of the conversation that is not brought up a lot of times when we talk about education for military children, and that I always try to bring to the table about it, is when we talk about good schools, what that looks like, right? As a Black woman with biracial children, frequently the good schools that are recommended on the military spouse pages in those arenas aren't the schools that my children are going to thrive at. And I say that because I once made the mistake of like just going on the whim of like, everybody says it's the best, district, that's where we need to live. And finding out that my child was the only Black student in the entire school. I was the only Black parent. That's a really awkward experience. And so when the whole town knows you because you went to one PTA meeting, when the teacher asks, is this your husband? Because the person sitting next to you is white, and so there's no way that could actually be your spouse, right? That's a part of the conversation we don't have. And so ever since then, the way that I approach schooling has been very different, because I know that it is not just the academics, it is the social, it is the entire experience of it. And for military families, which represent such a diverse range of people, that has to be part of the consideration. When you move into the idea of choice, into the idea of a hierarchical kind of version of schools, not only are we putting a lot of our military kids in a kind of disadvantaged space, but also our military children of color, so, and their families of color. So I think that's something to really include in the conversation and keep in mind as this progresses.
Thank you, Tanya. Eileen, feel free to respond.
Sorry, I just wanted to say I'm so glad that Tanya brought this point up. I think it's such an important point when we're having this conversation. And I also wanted to give Julie a shout out, because she runs a Facebook group that I think many of us are probably aware of, the Greater Alexandria Military Spouses. And I think she and her co-moderators have been so thoughtful about the way they've addressed this question that comes up quite a bit in the group, well, how do I find a good school for my children? And I think, I just wanted to give you kudos for the information that you've put together and the thoughtful way that you and your fellow moderators address that question, because it is a lot more, it's a more complicated question, I think, than a lot of people think. And it kind of plays into a lot of conscious and unconscious biases. And I think your group has been really great about, deflecting those.
Thank you, Eileen. If I could just piggyback on that to explain how we do that really quickly. We use the state report cards. We ask parents to get firsthand information and talk to the other parents in the schools and look at the school district website specifically. So we don't allow any negative comments if they're not firsthand information. That's sort of how we approach that, and using the data that's there. So, and the group is now GAMS, National Capital Region Military Spouses.
Oh,
it's okay. Once we hit 5,000 members, Facebook would not allow us to change the permalink. So it's just, it is what it is. But thank you, Eileen.
Well, there's a lot of different themes that we've all touched upon. I'm going to end this poll if anyone wants to take a second to finish it. But, I think that there are concerns. They're all very, very valid concerns. One of them is that has been brought to my attention, and I would love to hear what everyone thinks about it, is costs and how costs will be impacted. Even the current structure right now is not, knowing or anticipating a influx of military students to one location. The market may not be ready for that, but we know, I guess it's been highlighted that how BAH housing pricing kind of mirrors what officer BAH is often in an installation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that housing is then available to the enlisted families, because that price point is a little too high. And so I wonder, especially those who've been in school choice environments, what is the thoughts on the cost? Anyone have any direct experience with how costs work, how they've been able to, make it work? Any ideas, any thoughts on that topic?
So are you asking about if anybody's utilized like a voucher option for school choice for their students?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've done a lot of close follow-up, like a third party for Florida, because that's where I grew up and started teaching. And the one thing I've heard from parents and teachers, this is not first person though, is that a lot of the schools that did accept vouchers, their costs have actually gone up. So like if the voucher was X $1,000 and normally it would subtract that amount from the tuition, you'd pay the lower amount. Then the next year the tuition was raised because they knew that the students were going to have access to those vouchers. And that to me is a really big concern, because if we, affordability is always a concern for military families, especially with the spousal unemployment being so high. But I think that's a worry, and that's why it hasn't passed in the state of Texas, because there's these other examples of where it's been very difficult to have that be a more sustainable model, because the prices have increased and they can't really necessarily control that. So that would be again, from just reading and being up to date on that, I would be concerned about that.
Thank you. I saw in the chat, Sela, you wanted to share. You can go next, and then Kayla.
Oh, yeah. So I am in the state of Florida and I use the voucher program. So I wanted to share. I am a Gold Star spouse. I use it for both of my kids. I actually homeschool. We were in the public school system. I have a child with autism. So the public schools failed my kids. That's all I'm going to say. They failed my kids tremendously, both of them in the state of Florida and in California, which is why I chose to homeschool. But if I didn't have that option to use the voucher, I would not be able to afford to homeschool and give them those services, whether it's private, curriculum, whatever it is. And so it truly has been a blessing for our family. And as far as like the last topic, it's half and half with the schools. So my oldest is now going into high school and he's going to be utilizing the voucher for a private school specifically for kids with autism. Their tuition didn't raise. It's exactly the same amount as what, well, it's a little bit more for what the voucher is. And then he's able to use folds of honor for the additional amount. So thankfully for him, he'll be able to use it. But there are some private schools that will raise the tuition, but that's not every school in the state of Florida. So I do want to give the positives as a parent, who is utilizing it, what the public school systems I've been in 3 different counties in the state of Florida, all near military installations, and they all failed my kids. So it's really unfortunate. But I do know that at least here in Florida, the government is trying to help as much as they could with military families. They don't have to, there's different vouchers they can use. And so that's another positive thing is they can speed up the process and don't have to show income. They do get special, I guess, privileges to utilize the vouchers and scholarships in the state of Florida.
Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing, both sides. Every side is welcome. We're here to learn about the ups and the downs. And so can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
So when you first got started with vouchers, you said you were homeschooling. Is that something how did you find out about that? Is that something that was publicized to you? Did you seek it out? What is the communication like? Because I think some people have brought up before, often we're not always aware. So in communities that it is available, how do they communicate that, whatever their policies are?
Yeah, so the SLO on the Navy base is actually the one who told me. So depending on where you're at, you can have a really good, school officer who gave me so many amazing resources. And so she did tell me about that. She didn't go into the extent of what it was because it was just, okay, there's a scholarship you can apply for, but then when I went into some parent advocate groups, that's where I really saw the breakdown of everything. And that's where I learned from other parents. So she gave me the initial, and then I did my own research with other parents and was able to find, because initially I couldn't homeschool with it. I'd have to do a private school. But then when I learned, once I had, because he has autism and he has that diagnosis, then I was able to utilize it that way. And then just in the last year, there is another one that opened up where kids who want to be homeschooled, who are just the average child, may not have a learning disability, can homeschool as well. So that's a new option that was just added last year.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate it.
Mhm.
Keila?
Wasn't going to get me twice. So I also wanted to talk about Florida. So it's similar there. So not firsthand, but in our work, in our case management, what we're seeing and what we're helping families through right now is that as they are PCSing into like that Hurlburt Eglin area, so many schools, they feel like they don't have a choice but to go through private schools because of how quality for their children, especially special needs children, has shifted within public schools. They just don't have that funding. And so what's happened is, because, as you mentioned, the costs are going up at the private schools, the voucher isn't covering the full amount. They're reaching out to us because that money that they would have allocated to after school care, they now have to allocate to just general education access. And so they can't afford to send their children. They could pay for the school, but then they wouldn't have the after school care that allowed them to keep their employment. So they're really having to choose then, like, do I send my child to this school, which does not, the public school, which does not have the systems, the support, the whatever that my child needs, or do I skip out on my other bills and utilize public resources like food banks and things like that to supplement so that I can afford both this school and the after school care needed to fill those gaps. So I just thought that was an interesting, it wasn't something that I had thought about prior to starting to work with these families, and we're seeing this more and more of the need for that after school piece and that funding not being available because now they have to spend extra on the schools that are nearby with them. And so just kind of food for thought out there as we're kind of iterating in what this looks like in real life.
Yeah, I think Caleb raises a really good point when it comes to cost, because one concern that I would have is, there can be additional costs that go along with a private school education that might not be fully covered by the ESA or the voucher. So if you're talking about uniforms or extracurriculars or test fees or any number of items that families might not be aware of when they decide to pursue this option. And so the kind of the worst case scenario is where families end up having to pay more out of pocket or go into a financial hole in order to make up for these additional costs. And so I apologize. I think I interrupted you.
No, you're okay. What I was going to say is this issue, at least in the state of Florida, I've been here for 10 years. So this issue has been going on for that long. So this isn't a new issue where, I mean, I honestly, I can do the research, but I do not think this is directly pertaining because of the vouchers. This has been going on prior, and is it mismanagement with the public school system with their money? Like, where is the money going? And I say this as a parent with a child with special needs. Why is it, my child is not getting the services when federally they're supposed to be getting the services because it says that on the IEP? Where's the money, and why did you not hire someone to give my child that service in the school? My younger son, who's now in 3rd grade, and I homeschool him too, he has never been able to utilize after school programs because there's either a wait, and then he's still on a 3-year wait to get after school program because they don't have enough staff. But again, is this because of the vouchers, or is it because of mismanagement with the school districts? And what I have been able to utilize, which has been a blessing, is if my kids were when they were close to the base, the school, they were able to utilize the on-base services. So the base, at least Mayport, has a youth center. They were able to pick them up from the public school and take them there, and they can utilize that after-school care that was there, which was a huge blessing. But then COVID happened, and all of that got taken away. So that was something completely different that had to do with DOD and not Florida. So there's just all these challenges that our kids face and our families face. And it's, I think, on both ends. It's not just the state, it could also be, federal too.
Yeah, well, thank you. I do know when last, and please, someone who is more on with the numbers of this, but I do know that federally, special education is funded like 30 cents on the dollar. So like what they're supposed to receive, they're not receiving. So it was never going to be able to cover every service. And that's not an excuse at all for what you're saying, Stella, but I think that that's a reality. So I do, prior to doing this, I worked on special education research. And so there's a lot to this conversation, and you brought up some really amazing topics, and I hope we can continue to touch upon them. So let's first, Kendall, if you would like to share, and then we'll continue on.
Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt, but so I'm Kendall Paulson, and much older than all of you. I grew up in the military, and then I married because he looked really cute in a flight suit. And so I've been in this arena for over 50 years. I won't tell you how close to 60 it is. So I was raised in the military, and then I raised 3 of my children as a military spouse. And I've been through the gamut. And Jennifer asked me because I accessed the DoD schools when we lived overseas, and what a great experience that was. And I have a niece now who's married to an Air Force guy. We forgive her because we were all Navy. And but the challenges she's facing in the DoD system is a whole nother subject. I just wanted to touch with Cecilia about Cecilia or Stella? Sorry, Stella. And Stella, my apologies. Old age, glasses, not as they should be. I have, of the 3 children, I was raised, didn't know, I was, did many tours as a kid in Hawaii. That's where they identified that I had dyslexia. So we have the 3 kids. Our youngest was born in Hawaii. We moved back to Virginia. It was like watching myself grow up, and I was like, she's definitely dyslexic. We have issues. Come to find out, she's not just dyslexic, she's ADHD, which brings in a whole other issues. I think you're right, Stella, that where you're located matters. Because in Northern Virginia, I forget who it was, Alexandra, it's a whole different world up here. We have a plethora of services in the public school system, and it starts right away. I will tell you that for our daughter, it did not work. However, because of the laws that DOE had put out in terms of equal and fair access, and I'm not sure if that's federal or if it's just the Commonwealth of Virginia, but fair and equal access meant that if they could not meet her needs, then we would find a school that could meet her needs. And in the end, they fully funded her education. There was no voucher system, and we don't have a voucher system here. We don't have any other. It's private or public, and that was a saving grace for us in the Northern Virginia. That's one of the reasons we picked here as our final destination. But also economically, we would have done everything, and we would have lost everything to pay for it. But that shouldn't be how it is. So my heart goes out to you, is what I'm saying, is that I'm sorry, you're absolutely right. The public school system should be supporting. Why they're not, I don't know. Again, I think it has a big difference with geography and where the state puts the money. So
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Definitely.
Yeah. So I don't know about voucher systems. I don't necessarily support it. I just know what my story is. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you, guys.
I obviously know that there are some populations here that we're talking about that are, maybe not at risk is the wrong word. It's a little too strong, but there's more questions involved. And so special education is one. I heard a few mentioning, I do know that private schools are not subject to IDEA. So of course, I saw in the chat popping through, and I forget who it was. So feel free to unmute. That they mentioned that there was an extra cost to pay for those direct additional services. So was that you, Alexandra?
That was me. That was me. So similar to Kendall, we identified that one of our children had a reading disability, like had struggles with reading, and ended up getting diagnosed with I can't even remember what it was called. It was a couple of years ago. But she doesn't have dyslexia, but she has reading disability, and according to IDEA, she was able to get services. But the school that she was at, she was in a Spanish immersion program, which was very important to us culturally, but couldn't get enough English. Like it was so limited in the services that she could get, and her day was all in Spanish. And that's why I was saying the charter schools can be a challenge. So we couldn't even move her like to a school where it was all English and have it be like a school that we would feel comfortable sending her to. We sent her to private school the next year. We found the best private school in the area for students with learning disabilities. And it was an amazing experience, but it was very expensive for our family. And had it been for more than 1 year, I'm not sure that we would be able to sustain that long term without significant hardship. There were additional costs. So you have your tuition, but because they do not have the same charge as public schools do with providing supportive services to students that have a disability, that was an extra cost for us. And so depending on how many small group sessions we wanted her to have, or additional services for her learning disability, we had to pay for those out of pocket for that school. And so I think that a lot of parents might not understand that, and if you don't know that and you go into it, it could be an even bigger cost than what you're originally thinking it's going to be. And so that's always my caution to parents, is like to make sure that you understand that when you're going from public to private or a different setting, like make sure that find out whether they can support your student, because they technically don't have the same charge.
Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot of different themes. I know that there's a lot that we don't know about what is possibly being, it's a proposed proposal right now. It's not even, something that's moving forward, but maybe there is some insights. I don't know, Eileen, have you heard anything? Is there any additional areas that we haven't touched upon that we should be thinking about or we could address?
So I haven't heard anything additionally about the executive order that directed the Secretary of Defense to look for school choice options for military children. I believe there's going to be a report forthcoming, or recommendations forthcoming, but I haven't seen anything yet. I will say that there has been legislation introduced in the Senate, sponsored by Senator Banks of Indiana and Senator Cruz of Texas, that would establish educational savings accounts for military children to be funded and administered through the Department of Defense, and authorizes, I think, about $1 billion or $1.2 billion for it. And the bill goes into a lot of detail about the amount of money. I think it's $8,000, up to $8,000 per child, potentially. And it goes into detail about who would be prioritized if more people applied for it than then there were funds available. But Senator Banks was a strong school choice proponent when he was on the House side, and introduced legislation several times that was very similar to this. And so now that he's in the Senate, and both the Senate and the House are controlled by Republicans who have historically been more supportive of school choice proposals, I wouldn't be surprised to see this bill get significant support. So this is a real, thing that is potentially going to happen. And I think it's, and so I think it's good that we're having this conversation so that we can talk through some of the ramifications for military families specifically. I think the protections for special needs students are a real issue because, as others have pointed out, private schools don't have to accept special needs children or make the same kind of accommodations that public schools do. When you're talking about the military context, private schools aren't bound by the interstate compact. So all of the protections that we talk about in terms of entrance requirements, graduation requirements, private schools are not, required to respect those. And so, I think it's just important to be really thoughtful about what the specific implications for military families could be, because we are a unique population.
Yeah. So another kind of area that I was just wondering if anyone has any experience with, and if anyone has anything that we haven't touched on that you definitely want to address, I'd love, feel free to just interject and share after we answer this question. But some of the concerns are also not necessarily enforcement, but what happens if wait lists are so long that our students are getting so delayed in their accessing education? Is there provisions, how would provisions on a private, non-federally connected organization, maybe it's federal funds are connected, and maybe that, Nicole, you might be able to speak to that of like, how does that work when federal funds are attached to something and someone receives a federal fund? How do we enforce any policies that are associated with those receipts of those funds? Is that successful? Is that something that could be a way to minimize that concern? These are just questions I have. So if anyone has any thoughts that are even peripherally related to that question, I would love to hear.
So I can speak on that, at least in the state of Florida. I don't think the funds were federal, it's state as far as the vouchers. The first year that I did apply for it, my son did get it, but implementing it was the challenge. And so I made calls to, the organization that they told me in the school district and Department of Education in the state of Florida, and got nowhere. But as soon as I talked to my legislators, within 3 weeks, it was taken care of. So I guess it depends on who you're talking to, but I called the governor's office, talked to the governor's office, and it was fixed within, like I said, I got to speak to him the day after and it was fixed. And I specifically said, we are a military family. This is what's going on. He's autistic, waiting for the funds. We're 2 months into the school year and I still haven't received them, and he immediately took care of it. So it can be done. It's just a matter of educating our parents of how to do it and who to speak to.
Well, and I think, to that point, I'll just say this is really where, resources, it's great to have lots of resources. It's great to have lots of, tools out there. But if families have a hard time accessing those resources and tools and actually making use of those resources and tools, then how beneficial are they really, besides probably checking a box somewhere? So I would say that, I'm glad that you got that fixed at the state level and they were able to address that. But I would say that that's probably even an opportunity to engage with your federally elected officials, just to say, hey, this program might not actually be working the way that you think it's working or the way that it's intended to, right? So that they can conduct their proper oversight of programming and of initiatives like this, and that they're better prepared to ask the right questions that actually get after the real, no kidding experience of families as they're trying to utilize some of these resources and these initiatives and programs. So I would just say that, taking it one step, even one step further, like, yes, you figured it out for yourself, so you don't need casework anymore, but you don't know that that's not the experience that others are having. Right. And you're doing a great job making sure to communicate, here's how you do it and here's who you talk to. But it doesn't need to be elevated to that, to that level every single time. At least it shouldn't be. At some point, it should become a standard, process that is more readily acceptable and more readily responded to. But I would just encourage you to have that conversation if you haven't already.
Yeah, and I do have to say, and I'm sorry if I cut anyone off, because I had this conversation over the weekend, because I was at the governor's mansion for an event, that when they're making these laws, and I think this goes hand in hand with any laws, they need to have real life people with them making these laws on the verbiage. So if it's this, parents of military kids, and helping to write these laws. I am a Gold Star spouse, so there are laws that are written that I've had to go in and say, why are certain families excluded? So why are we not, when we're making these laws or lobbying or whatever it is, we should be having these families, especially our military families, sitting in and helping and giving their experience and their words and exactly of what needs to be added. And so obviously advocacy is my heart, and I learned it from not knowing anything until I eventually lived it, and now I'm helping. So, but I shouldn't at the very beginning, and any of our military families and service members and veterans shouldn't have to go through an experience of not having something or losing something in order to get to that point of becoming an advocate. So that's my point on it. But I did share that this weekend, which is kind of funny because that's exactly what I said. Why are they writing these bills? Why are they writing all of this without the input of us? And that's us here.
Well, I appreciate you sharing and everyone sharing, because I think that's the purpose of having these conversations. It will inform the things I'm writing about it. I hope that it informs the people who are having these conversations as well. Outside of this call, that they can take some of these voices and these opinions and share them beyond here. Any other, enforcement related thoughts, insights, questions? I think that for me, it's, what do you do? I know Tanya, you brought up, areas possibly of discrimination that could happen. Others, whether it's racial or with special education, what do military families do? Not everyone is going to necessarily reach out to a governor or a congressional representative, and they might just deal with it. And what does that look like for that family? And so those are the questions I have. I'd love to hear if anyone has any thoughts or any direct experience they'd like to share.
Well, and I would just say, and I hope I'm understanding you correctly, but part of the issue with the way these vouchers are structured is that there often isn't a requirement that schools adjust their admissions policies, even though they're receiving state or federal dollars. And so if, in the legislation I referenced earlier, for example, it specifically says that schools who participate won't be required to adjust their admissions policies. And so if they have a policy that restricts admission to a certain religion, for example, they'd still be able to participate in the ESA program that's envisioned in this legislation. So, and so that really leaves a military family without any recourse, because, there's nothing to require the school to accept any child that they don't want to. And sometimes there's good reasons for that, because maybe the school feels that, they're not able to meet the needs of a specific student. And sometimes they have made choices about the population of, the students that they want to serve.
Thank you for that insight. I want to be sure that we touch upon any topics that we haven't yet touched upon. Is there anything anyone didn't have an opportunity to share that they would like to bring up or expand on? Yeah, go for it, Kendall.
Yeah, the other thing is the hardest thing, I think, for military families, and as it relates to school systems, where we fly in and we fly out. We're not there, they look at us and they're like, we know that you're here for 18 months to 3 years, and your kid is a pass through. And, that's the other thing to think about, is like, I don't know about you guys, but when I was prepping to move every time, I would like do a cursory. First off, this technology of knowing what good schools were, that didn't come until way after when my kids were little, and I could start to kind of research that. But before that, it was word of mouth. We didn't know. But the thing to remember is, like, we have to, somehow this has got to be made easier and better for military families, because we're not there long enough, and how can we change the system so that they understand that our goal is to get the best for our kids when we land in that base, and for that period of time. And then, and then as we move to the next place, that should be the priority, is making this process as best and easy for us and the best what it is for our kids. Because we're doing it enough already. We're not home with our family. These kids should be the priority when we fly in and fly out. And schools should recognize that, as these kids are an asset, not a temporary. And that's how I think. When you want to sit at the table, that's part of the discussion that has to happen, that they have to be as equally valued when they show up, if not more, because these kids are being moved around for this national security. And, anyway, that's how I feel. I'll get off my soapbox.
Appreciate it. Anyone else have anything they'd like to share or add to the conversation that we didn't get to touch upon?
Can I just piggyback on what Kendall just said? My name's Kayla. I'm sorry I'm late.
No, thanks. Welcome.
I just wanted to piggyback. We lived in Newport, Rhode Island, and most people that are there for War College. It's a 1-year tour. And we flat out had numerous people at the school district tell us that we weren't going to be around long enough to sue them, so they were going to do whatever they want. And they were very blatant with that. And so there were families that ended up homeschooling, pulling their kids out. But I mean, I'd never lived anywhere where it was so blatant, where they were like, we know that this is when your tour is up. We know what your husband's here doing. Therefore, we're going to do what we want to do, and good luck to you. And it was a pretty challenging situation. Ironically, my cousin's wife is the attorney general in Rhode Island right now. And that's something that we've brought to her attention. We were in Newport, not Middletown, but it was extremely blatant. And that, just to piggyback on what Kendall was saying before, when these kids fly in, we fly out. We're only there for a short tour. There's not that continuity. And so that is definitely a specific challenge.
Yeah. I mean, I know this is something that has been ongoing, and that's why, Nicole and Eileen and others in this space have been kind of working these issues for military connected students. It's special education, it's, MIC3, it's all of these policies have been put into place for decades, if not, I think decades. I don't think we're in centuries yet, but decades, to address this weird complexity. Special education isn't serving the average student. We know that that's not happening, and it's not. But I guess the question is, how will this new dynamic help or hinder our children's education? Because, that's really, I think, what the bottom line is for most families, is how am I going to set my kids up for success? And, for military families who have those additional layers, what are those layers, and how can we talk about them and address them and maybe remove as many of them as we can? Is there anything that we didn't get to talk about? We only have 3 minutes left, but I wanted to either give Eileen a last word, or someone else, if anyone else has anything they'd like to share. I am available. You have my email. If you have anything else you want to email me, feel free. I think you have Eileen's email as well. If anyone in this call wants to share contact information, if you're sharing on behalf of an organization, I will put it in the notes that I email out as a resource. If it's just your personal, feel free to direct message each other. That's totally fine as well. That won't be shared, but wanted to just make that available. Eileen, did you have anything you want to share as we were wrapping up?
Just to say that I really appreciate this conversation. It's a real pleasure to speak with so many, informed and passionate advocates. And I appreciate the different perspectives that everyone brought to this issue. I think it's very complicated. And, I think it's important to elevate military family voices as this conversation is happening at the federal level, as Stella pointed out, so that we can make sure that the kind of unique experiences of military families are taken into account as these policies are being drafted.
Thank you.
So I'm really grateful to have had this opportunity.
Thank you for coming, and thanks everyone for coming to share their expertise and their experiences. Unfortunately, normally I do have available time to stick on for a few minutes after. But for now, I'll just end the recording, but we can stay for a few minutes if anyone has any questions where we won't be recording. And let's see here.